Hello, welcome, and today is the 21st day of Sivan, the 27th of June, and we're up to the fifth reading of Parshat Shlach. And in the fifth reading, we have one commandment, which Maimonides doesn't even count as a commandment because it's an adjunct to every sacrifice that's brought, and it's called the wine libation and the grain offering. And basically, for every type of sacrifice that was brought in the land of Israel, you needed to add to it a wine libation, which was a certain amount of wine, which was not poured on the altar itself, but was poured into special cups on the altar. It wasn't put on the fire. And the grain offering, which was eaten, at least in part. Now, it changes for whatever type, if you're bringing a lamb or a goat, under a year old, or a ram, which is an animal, it's a goat who is over 3 years old, or a bull, ox, or cow, the quantities of the libation and the grain offering change. Now, the way that this starts is, it says like this. It actually started in yesterday's reading, but we're reading it now because that was the introduction, and we want to get into the concept here. So let me just read it from the beginning. In Numbers 15:1, God spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you arrive in the land of your dwelling place which I am giving to you, and you make a fire offering to God, and a scent offering or a festive offering, a sacrificial, or you make a sacrificial vow as a sacrificial dedication, or on your festivals to please God from the herd or from the flock, the one who brings his offering to God must present a grain offering containing 1/10 of fine flour mixed with a quart of oil, and you must offer a quart of hin of wine with the ascent offering or the feast offering as a libation for each lamb," and so on. And then, like we said, in our fifth reading, it continues with this. The point to note here is that this is something that it begins with when you come to the land of Israel. What did we just end with? We just ended with the sin of the scouts, the spies. And the verdict that God gave, which was that you won't be able to come into the land for the next 38 years. And it's really only your children that will go there. So what is this really? So the way everybody explains is that when you give such a verdict, you also have to tell people, you have to give them some horizon, some hope. And God says, I'm going to give you now 2 commandments that are only to be practiced in the land of Israel when you arrive. You don't do this in the wilderness. And this is like a sign for you that you will eventually be there. So the 2 commandments are, like we said, the libations and the grain offerings that accompany every sacrifice. And we don't do this today because we don't have sacrifices. And something that we do today, in fact we do it everywhere, it's called challah. Taking a small amount of the first dough that you make and giving that to the priest. Today we don't have a priesthood in that sense, so we burn it, we don't use it. And these 2 commandments together, and again I mentioned that Maimonides doesn't count the libations and grain offerings as a separate commandment because it's part of the requirements of giving a sacrifice. So these 2 commandments, in any case, they come as a revelation that you will end up in the land of Israel. It's going to happen. But now the question is, why these 2? What's so special about these 2? And so the way to understand these is, what does a libation and a grain offering do to the sacrifice? The way we might think about this is that bringing a sacrifice, again, what does he say here? That you're doing it in order to fulfill a vow. It's also when you bring other sacrifices. But the Torah here mentions specifically when you fulfill a vow. So says the Baal HaTurim, one of the important commentaries on the Torah, he says, we need to understand it like this, that it's going to be difficult to conquer the land of Israel. In fact, it's difficult to live in the land of Israel. It's not something that comes easily. So why all this difficulty? He says the reason that God makes it difficult is so that you make vows. Now this is, especially to an observant ear, is a little hard to hear. But that is exactly how the Torah expects us to behave. That when we have difficulties in life, we make a vow. Now this is very common. I didn't know this until I was much older. But every time I would travel from college back to my parents, my father made a vow to give a certain amount of money to tzedakah, to charity. And thank God it worked for him. But the idea is that when you have difficulty in life, it's not just to make you think again about how you're conducting yourself and so on. We'll get to that in a moment. But it's first of all that the way that a person who lives with God functions is they come and say that the difficulties are here to awaken me to do more mitzvot, more commandments. And it's not some kind of bakshish, as they say. It's not some kind of bribe. It's coming and saying, if I'm under scrutiny now, I want to be on my better behavior. I want to dedicate myself more. But it's much more than that, because you're not just making, that could be the sacrifice itself. That I vow to give a sacrifice if I'm successful in whatever I'm doing now. We have an example of this in the story of Yiftach, Yefti, as he's called in English, and his daughter. And Yefti was a non-religious or non-observant man who was not even living in the land of Israel at the time, in the Gilad, where the northern tribes were. And they called upon him, this was in the time of the judges, and they called upon him to be there, to lead them into war against the Midianites. And Yefti made a vow, and he said, the first thing that comes out of my door, if I return safely, I will sacrifice to God. And then, of course, his daughter came out. That was the first thing that greeted him. And the whole story with that, we'll leave that for the moment. But this is a very common thing, but it's much more than that. We'll see in Deuteronomy, and I believe I've talked about this in the past because it's a very surprising verse to most people, that God expects us to make vows when faced with difficulties. Because the vows are meant to strengthen our commitment to commandments. It's like saying a lot of times, why would you do this? It sounds like you're giving a bribe, but it's not. The difficulties in life are a challenge. And they're asking us, are you committed to this or not committed to this? And God wants to help you with it, but He's giving you the challenge in order to do more. But that could explain the sacrifice. The libation and the grain offering is beyond that. It's coming and saying, because the libation and grain offering are not part of the sacrifice, they adorn it. There's something that comes on top of it. They make it more beautiful, more pleasing, more appealing. So what are these about? And the way that this is explained in Hasidic thought is that the libations and grain offering, these adornments of the sacrifice, the adornments, let's call it, of the vow, are really tapping into our highest superconscious faculty, our faculty that's called self-sacrifice. It's not just a sacrifice, it's self-sacrifice. And what this is saying is that just as the things that are beautiful in life, they touch upon something more than just our survival. The sacrifice here is like what we need in order to survive. It's the blunt message. If you want to get through this difficulty, you need to do something more. That's very understandable. But it's not just that. I'm not doing it because I'm under pressure. That's exactly the point here. I don't want it to look like a bribe. I don't want it to look like I'm doing this because I'm being coerced to. No, I'm doing it because I believe that this is really the purpose of my life, and that this difficulty that I have now is to alert me and to connect me more to my purpose. How do I show that this is not done out of coercion, but out of true faith, the faculty of my superconscious, the faculty of my crown? I do that by bringing pleasure with it, the pleasure of the wine, the pleasure of the grain offering, the beauty of them. They adorn the sacrifice. They adorn the commitment. They come and say that the sacrifice I'm doing, this self-sacrifice, is not just coming from a place of survival. I'm doing much more than that. I really do believe that this is what brings down the beauty of the infinite into the finite. And so I'm offering something that's beyond. It's called a hidur mitzvah. It's making the mitzvah beautiful. So a person comes and says, let's say, I promised $100 for a trip that my son is taking. I come and say, yes, $100, it's very nice, but I'm also going to bring candles to the shul, or something like that. I'm also going to make the spiritual presence of God in our lives more beautiful. And that is called true self-sacrifice, because here, I'm not just giving for my survival. That I need in order to survive. That's just my sacrifice. The self-sacrifice is the same thing as what makes us into people. What makes us into people? Our appreciation for beauty, our appreciation for the spiritual part of life. And when you bring that, you bring the libation, you bring the grain offering, what you're doing is you're saying that this is not just that I was coerced into this. This, I feel, is really the purpose of life. This is really what makes life worth living, not just capable of being lived. It's not just my survival. It's also about making my life beautiful with the infinite within the finite. And this specifically was a reaction to the sin of the spies, who believed that it wasn't worthwhile to endure the hardships of conquering the land of Israel. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to remain in the wilderness and to live a very secluded, protected life with God. But God wants more. He says, I don't want to provide for you all the time, in the sense that I provide for you, but I want you to contribute your part to it. I don't want it, as we discussed yesterday, to become bread of shame. I don't want it to be something that you get for free. I want you to toil for it. But the toil itself needs to be beautified. The feeling that I'm working for God needs to be a feeling that everything that has to do with the presence of God in my life is beautiful, it's adorned, it's something that I cherish. It's not just something that I have to do. So thank you very much for joining today. Hope to see you tomorrow.